Hi everybody, you're watching The Sit Down. I'm DJ Sixsmith. Thrilled to be joined by Charles Fishman. Charles, you got your brand new book, One Giant Leap. How are you?
I'm great, thank you.
Good to meet you. Welcome to New York.
Thank you.
So this has kind of been your life in terms of going into the whole space world. And it's been 50 years since men had gotten to the moon. So when you think about writing this book, learning what you did, why did you jump into it?
There are two big reasons to tell the story of Apollo. One is, it's just a kind of kicky story. It's a rollicking story. We have completely lost track of how much an adventure it was. We sent 3 electric cars to the moon, and then astronauts got in them and drove around, and they just laughed hysterically.
Yeah, they're just frolicking around doing their thing.
It was fun. The first astronauts to drive around on the moon, Dave Scott and Jim Irwin, literally on the first run with the lunar rover, it's called, the sort of moon car, they got going so fast downhill that they turned a 180 and ended up pointed up while they were sliding down. And Mission Control couldn't figure out what was going on, and they were just laughing.
Wow.
But wow, here we are zooming across the moon in a kind of moon dune buggy. It was an incredible thrill ride. It was an incredible adventure, and Americans and the whole world got to go along. Like, we got to watch every step of the way. So it's fun to unpack that. The spacesuits that went to the moon were made by Playtex, the Cross Your Heart Bra people. By the way, that division of Playtex, there have been lots of corporate comings and goings, is still making the spacesuits that you see the astronauts in the space station using. So it worked out well. But who knew, right? Who knew the spacesuits were made by Playtex? The flag, NASA almost forgot to take a flag.
Seriously?
We're all familiar with the sort of iconic image, Buzz Aldrin, the flag. The day after that first moon landing in the newspapers around the world, July 21st, 1969, I probably looked at 300 front pages of newspapers. More than half of them used the picture of the flag. But just a few weeks before Apollo 11 was supposed to blast off, NASA hadn't thought at all about the celebration, right? The procedures had been practiced 1,000 times. The scientific experiments were designed. The astronauts had checklists sewn onto their spacesuits so they would know what to do on the surface of the moon, and no one at NASA had sort of stopped and said, this is going to be kind of a big moment. Maybe
should make it look good, right?
Maybe North Pole style, Columbus style, we ought to plant a flag. And so they literally had to scramble in the last 10 weeks to come up with a flag that was safe. The flag itself was a standard off-the-shelf flag. It cost $3. But it has this marvelous contraption. It has an arm that was hinged like a curtain rod, and then when the astronauts planted it, they could extend the flag.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Because there's no air on the moon, right? The flag would just hang like that. And so one of the technical people in Houston came up with it, and it was so late that it wasn't on there, what to do on the moon checklist, and the flag had to be flown all packed up like tent poles overnight one night in a Gulfstream jet from Houston to the Cape. So there's just these great stories about what was required to get to the moon, and that's one reason to pay attention. It's a fun adventure, and it wasn't so very long ago. You know what I mean? We're not writing about a fun adventure from 1865.
Right. Well, there's many fascinating details that you discover in this, and one of the interesting ones that I was intrigued by was just the smell of the moon. Like, I've never thought about the smell of the moon. And when you just have those accounts in there, and those are just like little details that you never would even think about, but as you start going through, you're like, there's so much more to this story that we haven't even uncovered yet.
Well, and that's what the fun is, right? So Armstrong and Aldrin are out there exploring the moon. Their spacesuits, their white spacesuits, get covered in moon dirt and moon dust. They get back in the spaceship. You know, the spaceship didn't work like Star Trek or Star Wars. There was no airlock. So when you got into the spaceship, it was a vacuum. And then you sealed the hatch and then repressurized it. Then you took off your spacesuit because you could breathe again. They unsnapped their helmets, and the inside of the lunar module was filled with this smell, which no one had ever smelled before. It was the smell of moon dirt coming in contact with air for the first time.
And like wet ashes was it
Armstrong,
right?
Neil Armstrong, the first man on the moon, described it as sort of fireplace ashes or charcoal grill fire after you were done cooking. And Aldrin said it smelled like the air after a fireworks show. And all the astronauts experienced the smell. And you know, that's a tiny little example of the idea that you send human beings to explore. There's all kinds of things you can do with robots. We've got great robots on Mars, but we don't actually know what Mars smells like. No
clue, right?
And we would not have known that the moon had a smell without sending human beings. And so there's all kinds of ways of chasing your curiosity if you're willing to send people.
No question about it. And so another interesting way to pique your curiosity is talking about JFK and his impact and his role with everything, because he says, hey, I want to send men to the moon. And then he kind of sours on the whole thing is what it sounded like. So how did JFK impact this entire mission with his assassination, with his initial words, and just overall with his thoughts on the mission?
We would not have gone to the moon if John F. Kennedy, in literally the 5th month of his presidency, hadn't said, let's go to the moon. Going to the moon was a Cold War sort of battlefront. The Russians were literally skunking the United States. First spaceship of any kind into space, first animals into space, recovered safely, first human being to space, first spaceship to the moon, first spaceship to hit the moon. They one after another, they ticked off milestones that we were not hitting. And Kennedy, the final straw was sending an astronaut to space, Yuri Gagarin, before we did, and it was having a huge impact worldwide. The Cold War wasn't some kind of athletic contest. Real wars were fought as part of the Cold War, and governments around the world and people around the world were really impressed with what the Soviets were doing. And Kennedy said, we've got to find a way of reminding the world who the actual dominant scientific engineering technology power in the world is, and it's not, they're doing this one thing, but it's not the Soviet Union. And in talking about what the US could do in space, the moon was the thing where everybody agreed if the US could get there, it was a way of trumping the Soviet Union. And this is actually not widely known. This came from sort of digging into the source material. There are secret tapes that John Kennedy made in the White House, in the Oval Office, and in the cabinet room. He had a taping system just like Richard Nixon had a taping system. And so there were things he wanted recorded for posterity. And there are two really important conversations about space that were private. The contents of which didn't come out until literally 25 years after his death. And in those conversations, he expresses a lot of doubt about the cost of going to the moon and what that cost was preventing him from doing otherwise. And he said over and over again, the only reason we're doing this is to beat the Russians in private. That was not his public stance, but by the fall of 1963, just before he went to Dallas, it was very clear that he'd been told, in one of those tapes, he was told, we will not go to the moon while you're president, Mr. Kennedy, even if you get a second term. That would take you to 68, first 3 weeks of 69. We won't make it until the middle of 69. And so at what point do you say, why should I bear the political cost?
Yeah, you just say, screw it, I'm going to get out of it.
And the budget cost for someone else's glory, for the glory of the next president. I don't think Kennedy was very politically savvy. He had a lot invested in, we're going to the moon. I don't think he ever would have stood up and said, let's not do this. What he would have done was, he would have talked about it a little less, and he would have let Congress set the pace with budgets. And once you slow the space race down, once you stop spending money on the moon, or you just reduce the budget, 10 or 15% a year, all of a sudden you're pushing things off, months and months and months. And so it's very clear, I think, that if Kennedy had not been killed and had won a second term, and his popularity ratings were between 60 and 70%. I don't think we would be celebrating the 50th anniversary of the moon landing now. I don't think it would have happened in 1969. And so, in some ways, it's really sad, but the assassination created this whole sort of aura of political protection around going to the moon. Going to the moon became a tribute to John Kennedy's dreams and leadership, and so no one was willing to pull the plug on it after that.
That's really interesting, and you mentioned the context because with Russia, I mean, you mentioned it, they're the leaders in the clubhouse in terms of what they're doing. They're right on the doorstep only a couple weeks before, right, in terms of what they were about to do?
Well,
How close was it?
Yeah, they were chasing us at that point. The Russian space program in the late 60s, as we got ready to land on the moon, their manned program was not as ambitious or as successful as it had been in the early 60s when the projects were easier. So what they did literally while that first moon mission, while Apollo 11 was flying to the moon, the Russians had a robotic probe at the moon. And this was their scheme. They were going to land on the moon, grab moon rocks and moon dirt with their robotic probe, blast back off, and get that moon dirt and those moon rocks back to the Soviet Union before Armstrong and Aldrin splashed down with their moon rocks. That was the plan.
That would have been crazy.
They wanted to be on stage at the same moment. And they in planning their mission, they missed a moon mountain. And their probe, instead of landing safely on the moon and collecting moon rocks and coming home, slammed into the mountain at 400 miles an hour.
Wow.
And so that was the end of that. But it was not a trivial mission. And as Armstrong and Aldrin were flying to the moon, the New York Times had 3 stories about this Soviet mission on the front page of the New York Times. So at the time, people knew the Russians were trying to, if not one-up us, at least kind of try and match us in their own way. And so the race continued right to the end.
Definitely. So thinking about your story, I mean, you spent so much time researching this. You spent so much of your career looking into NASA and everything going on in space. How much does it bother you when people say the moon landing's fake or they have certain doubts when it comes to travel in space? How much does that irk you?
Look, I've spent the last 4 years trying to understand what it took to go to the moon. I want to live in that world. I want to live in the world where it took 400,000 people on Earth to send those 11 missions out into space, those 11 Apollo missions. Those people literally gave their heart and soul for that 11 years. Whatever the modern image is, Silicon Valley, it required that level of intensity. It required incredible creativity, incredible determination. 10,000 problems had to be solved. And when they started, they didn't even know what 5,000 of them were.
Right.
And so I want to live in the world where ordinary people kind of reach outside themselves. It was a heroic mission, and it was a heroic achievement, but there are no superheroes. They're only ordinary people, sort of called to do something that they themselves would not have imagined they could do. It's very simple to understand why the moon missions weren't faked. You can put aside, there's literally 6 billion pages of documentation.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay? Maybe you think that's all fake too. The Russians were flying to the moon at the same moment we were. The Russians kept what they called fishing trawlers right off Cape Kennedy, monitoring the launches and trying to jam radio communications. Fishing trawlers that, as they reported at the time, were odd in that there were never any fishing nets on the fishing trawlers.
Interesting.
If the moon landings had been faked, the Soviets would have called us out in the blink of an eye.
No doubt.
They would have known because they were tracking everything we were doing. So if you want to live in the world where we didn't land on the moon, you live in that weird fantasy world. But by the way, hand over your cell phone, because all of the technology that was necessary to get us to the moon got its start sort of in that big bang. And so I don't want to argue with those folks, because you're not going to persuade them. but I don't want to live in that world. I want to live in the real world, which is kind of amazing.
Yeah, no doubt about it. Let's live in reality and camp out here, because you mentioned the digital age, and that's one of the points you make in the book, is that by going to the moon, it starts the whole digital revolution. So how did you come about that thought? And when you look at the flight to the moon, how did it actually impact the digital age?
Look, you asked to start, why did I do this? The other reason I did this book is because there's a little bit of a sense of disappointment about Apollo.
Mm-hmm.
Like, we don't live in the world of Star Wars. We don't live in the world of Star Trek. Like, it's been 50 years.
Right.
If you go back 50 years from the moon landings, backward in time, then you're at 1919. Look how much progress. There was barely aviation in 1919, right? So in that 50 years, we went from barely having mastery of flight to landing on the moon. What have we done since landing on the moon? Where is the USS Enterprise, right? But it turns out that what Apollo did was it really lit the fuse on the digital age. The computers that were necessary to fly Apollo to the moon were the fastest, smallest, most nimble computers ever created. And they relied on a then untested technology that even IBM wouldn't use, called integrated circuits, the computer chip, right? Most of us don't even take a walk without our computer chips anymore, right? But in those, computer chips run everything. NASA helped create the market for computer chips, and then computer chips created the world we live in. So would we have iPhones? Would we have Microsoft Word? Would we have Amazon.com without going to the moon? Sure, but we'd have a word processor without Bill Gates, and we'd have smartphones without Steve Jobs, right? You don't take away someone's achievement because at some point someone else would have done it. Apollo really laid the groundwork for the digital age, which started to blossom just 2 or 3 years later. And that is completely overlooked. You know, you say to people, what do we get from the moon? And they sort of, kind of smirk and say, Tang? Velcro? Right? What we got is the world we live in now. Definitely. No, we don't vacation on the moon.
Sure.
You can't fly to Mars and do your PhD research. and hopefully it won't be 50 years before some of those things actually start to happen, because we're at the beginning of a new space race and space age. But we live in a world that Apollo helped make possible. And I think it's really important at the 50th anniversary to sort of pause and be able to reassess that and appreciate that back on Earth, going to the moon had a huge impact.
Definitely, and your book takes a step back and said, hey, there are all these incredible people that helped us get to this point, and you mentioned it, the future looks bright as well. So when you do think about the next 10, 15, 20 years of space travel, what intrigues you the most about that?
What's changing is that the commercial world really wants to find a way to go to space. When something's driven by the government, the only motivation is whatever the policy you're chasing is. There was a letdown after Apollo because, in fact, the only reason we were going to the moon in policy terms was to beat the Russians. We did a tremendous amount of science. We did a tremendous amount of technology development to get there. But in terms of the pure motivation, what's the point of this? The people funding it, the people paying for it, the point was get there before the Soviets got there. Elon Musk with SpaceX, Jeff Bezos with Blue Origin, those guys are trying to create a space economy. They're trying to bring the price of going to space down by 90 or 95%. If instead of costing $100 million to ride a rocket to space with a payload, it costs $5 million or $1.5 million.
It's a different story.
It's just like broadband internet, right? You can do one thing with your 56K modem and something else completely with your Google 1 terabyte connection, right? When Steve Jobs stood on stage and introduced the iPhone, whatever it was, just 12 years ago, no one thought, I bet smartphones are going to revolutionize traffic management, right? And it turns out, completely unexpected but brilliant use of these phones we all carry around, you can understand what's happening in the world of traffic. When you reduce the cost of going to space by 95%, you are going to see the blossoming of a space economy that doesn't exist. there's a great example that I don't think most people are aware of right now, one of the sort of earliest pioneers into the space economy. Right this minute, the surface of the Earth, the land surface of the Earth, every square foot is photographed every single day. And just being able to take a picture of everything every day. What did that look like a week ago? What did that look like a month ago? What did that look like yesterday?
You have a whole database.
That's how we know what the North Koreans are doing.
Yeah.
Because we watch their trucks and their ships and their trains and their construction sites. That's how we know what's happening with drought, with flooding, with climate change. The ability to take a picture of the entire surface of the Earth every day is just astonishing. Well, that's the kind of sort of unexpected development that lowering the cost of going to space is going to do. And so I think we're going to look back 50 years from now at this moment and say, wow, that was kind of an inflection point. It's led to the world we might have imagined would follow Apollo, but it's self-sustaining. When the commercial world steps in, that's what you get. You get something that has a reason for being outside of somebody saying, let's do that.
How about for you? I heard you spent some time at zero gravity yourself. That must have been pretty wild.
The author photo for the book, the official author photo, is me
I love that.
floating in zero gravity.
That's got to be like an all-time author photo right there.
I hope so. I mean, look, if you can't have some fun when you're writing a book about going to the moon, right? The next person for the 100th anniversary, those men and women who write that book will get to go to the moon.
Right.
I did not get to go to the moon. So I just thought, you know, I want to have a tiny little taste of what this is like. And you can go, NASA used to call it the Vomit Comet because some people get airsick when they're in zero gravity. It flies really fast uphill and then it flies over the top and flies down really fast. And there's a period of 35 seconds where you're floating, where you're in zero gravity. And I think I did about 30 of those loops. They just fly them over and over again.
Just keep going over and over.
And you never get tired of it. And you know, the astronauts will tell you this. Look, I didn't have to try and eat in zero gravity, or try and go to the bathroom in zero gravity.
A little different.
Or try and take a shower.
Yeah.
But what's so astonishing is how comfortable it is. How it feels wonderful. And for me anyway, the adjustment period was instantaneous. I left my pen right here and my notebook right here, and I would go do something, and I'd come back, and there they were, you know. Just pick them up. And it's kind of nice to leave things floating in the air.
Not a bad
I could have a different filing system for my papers that way.
Well, Charles, it's been a pleasure. Thanks so much for coming in.
Thank you, man.
Why don't you tell everybody where they can check out the book?
The book is One Giant Leap, The Impossible Mission That Flew Us to the Moon. And you can get it at your local bookstore, and you should try your local bookseller. And you can also get it at Amazon and BarnesandNoble.com. You can get the audio book, which is beautifully narrated by a guy named Fred Sanders. And you can download it instantly as an ebook.
There you go. You can get it everywhere. Technology, we're rocking. That's Charles. I'm DJ. We'll see you next time here on The Sit Down.